In the heart of Seattle, Washington, where the Puget Sound shimmered under the gray veil of morning mist, the Harrison family lived in a sprawling mansion perched on a hill overlooking the city's skyline. The house, a masterpiece of glass and steel, gleamed like a jewel against the backdrop of evergreen forests and distant snow-capped mountains. Edward Harrison, a titan of the real estate world, had built his empire by reshaping Seattle's urban landscape, his name synonymous with towering condos and sleek office complexes that defined the city's modern identity. His wealth was vast, his influence undeniable, and his ambition relentless. Yet within the walls of his opulent home, a heavy silence reigned, one that no amount of money could break. At the center of this silence was his 8-year-old daughter Lily, a girl who had not spoken a single word since the day she was born. Lily was a mystery wrapped in a quiet smile. Her delicate features, porcelain skin, wide hazel eyes, and a cascade of chestnut curls made her look like a porcelain doll, but her silence set her apart from the world. She wasn't deaf, nor was she mute. Every doctor Edward had flown in from across the country confirmed that her vocal cords were perfectly functional. Specialists from Mayo Clinic to Johns Hopkins had run tests, scanned her brain, and probed her throat, all concluding the same thing physically: there was nothing wrong. "She can speak," one renowned neurologist had said. Adjusting his glasses with a sigh, "She just doesn't want to." The words stung Edward like a personal failure. He had conquered boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and shaped skylines, but he couldn't make his daughter say a single word. Clara, Lily's mother, carried the weight of that truth differently. Her days were a blur of exhaustion, her eyes, shadowed from sleepless nights, spent wondering what she had done wrong. She had read every parenting book, consulted every therapist, and prayed in the quiet hours before dawn, but the silence persisted, growing heavier with each passing year. The Harrison mansion was a paradox, a place of grandeur filled with emptiness. Its marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and its floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Seattle's waterfront, but the air inside felt stifling. The staff moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled on plush carpets, aware that any loud noise might disturb the delicate balance of the household. Lily spent most of her time in the garden, a lush oasis of roses, ferns, and cherry blossoms that Clara had designed to be her daughter's sanctuary. There, Lily would sit cross-legged on a stone bench, sketching in a worn notebook. Her drawings were vivid scenes of birds soaring over the sound waves, crashing against the shore, or imaginary creatures with wings and glowing eyes. She poured her world onto paper, her pencil moving with a grace that belied her age. But no matter how expressive her art, it couldn't fill the void left by her silence. Clara would watch from the terrace, her heart aching as she saw Lily's lips move slightly, as if whispering to the flowers, only to fall still again. Edward's response to Lily's silence was to throw money at it. He had flown in speech therapists from London, psychologists from Boston, and even a holistic healer from Santa Fe, who claimed to channel energy through crystals. Each expert arrived with optimism and left with apologies. Their methods, flashcards, music therapy, play-based interventions, yielding nothing but Lily's gentle smile. Edward's frustration grew with each failure. He would pace his study, a cavernous room lined with mahogany bookshelves and framed awards, muttering about how no problem was unsolvable. "If I can build a skyscraper in 18 months, he'd say to Clara, his voice tight, "I can fix this." But Clara, her patience worn thin, would snap back. "She's not a building, Edward." Their arguments echoed through the mansion, sharp and fleeting, before dissolving into the same oppressive quiet. Lily, ever observant, would watch these exchanges from the doorway, her eyes flickering with something unreadable, before she retreated to her garden. The city of Seattle moved on outside the Harrison estate, oblivious to the family's private struggle. Ferries glided across the Sound, carrying commuters to and from downtown. The Space Needle stood sentinel in the distance, its silhouette a constant in the ever-changing sky. Tourists flocked to Pike Place Market, tossing fish and sipping coffee, while tech workers in hoodies filled the cafes of Capitol Hill. But inside the mansion, time seemed to stand still. Lily's silence was a puzzle no one could solve, a wound no one could heal. Clara tried to fill the void with activities, piano lessons, art classes, even a brief attempt at ballet. But Lily would only participate quietly, her movements precise but wordless. The other children at these classes whispered about her, calling her the quiet girl, their voices carrying a mix of curiosity and pity. Clara overheard them once and drove home in tears, clutching the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. One gray morning in early spring, as rain pattered softly against the mansion's windows, a new sound disrupted the routine. The kitchen staff noticed it first, a low gurgle followed by a faint hiss. The pipes in the West Wing part of the mansion's intricate plumbing system had sprung a leak. Water seeped into the hardwood floors, pooling in the hallway outside Lily's room. Edward, already late for a meeting with investors, barked orders to the staff to call someone immediately. Clara, sipping her coffee with a tired sigh, suggested they hire a local plumber, rather than wait for Edward's preferred contractors from downtown. "Just get it fixed," Edward said, grabbing his coat and heading out the door. By mid-morning, a battered blue pickup truck rolled up the winding driveway, its engine rumbling like a distant storm. The driver, a man in his early 40s named Tom, stepped out toolbox in hand. He wore faded overalls, a flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows, and a baseball cap tilted slightly to one side. His hands were calloused, his boots scuffed, but his eyes carried a warmth that seemed out of place in the sterile grandeur of the Harrison estate. Tom was a man of few pretensions. He'd grown up in a small town outside Seattle, the son of a fisherman, and had learned his trade from his uncle, a gruff plumber who believed in hard work and harder coffee. Tom's life was simple. He fixed pipes, paid his bills, and spent his weekends fishing or tinkering with his old truck. He wasn't the kind of man Edward Harrison would notice, let alone invite into his world. But Lily noticed him. She was in the garden as usual, sketching a pair of gulls circling above the Sound, when she heard the unfamiliar sound of Tom's boots crunching on the gravel path. She looked up her pencil, pausing mid-stroke. Tom, unaware of her gaze, set his toolbox down near the mansion's side entrance and began inspecting the outdoor valve. He hummed a tune, a soft, upbeat melody that floated through the garden like a breeze. Lily tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried and deliberate, that held her attention. Tom noticed her a moment later, catching her stare from across the garden. He raised a hand in a friendly wave, his smile easy and unguarded. "Hey there," he called, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who'd spent years in the Pacific Northwest. "Nice garden you got here. Bet it's a great spot for drawing." Lily didn't respond, but her lips curved into a faint smile, her fingers tightening around her pencil. Tom didn't push. He turned back to his work wrench in hand and began loosening a rusty bolt. The clank of metal against metal mingled with his humming, creating a rhythm that seemed to blend with the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a gull. Lily watched her notebook forgotten on her lap. For the first time in years, her eyes sparkled with something new. Not words, not yet, but a flicker of connection to a world she'd long kept at a distance. Inside the mansion, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the scene unfold. She saw the way Lily's posture shifted, how her shoulders relaxed, as she leaned forward to watch Tom. It was a small change, barely noticeable, but to Clara, it felt like a crack in the wall of silence that had defined their lives. She set her coffee cup down, her hands trembling slightly. Edward was in a meeting downtown, negotiating a deal that would add another tower to Seattle's skyline. But Clara's world was here in this moment, watching her daughter watch a stranger. She didn't know who Tom was or why he seemed to hold Lily's attention, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. The leak in the pipes was a minor inconvenience, a problem to be solved with a wrench and a few hours of work. But what was happening in the garden felt different, like the first drop of rain before a storm that could change everything. The morning wore on, and Tom worked steadily, occasionally glancing at Lily and offering a nod or a grin. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were simple, grounded in the everyday. "This valve's older than my truck," he said at one point, chuckling as he wiped sweat from his brow. "Gotta treat it gentle, or it'll put up a fight." Lily's smile widened, and though she didn't speak, her eyes followed his every move. When Tom packed up his tools to check the indoor pipes, Lily stood and trailed behind him at a distance, her notebook clutched to her chest. Clara, still watching, felt her heart race. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was something. The mansion with its chandeliers and marble floors had never felt so alive. And Lily, the girl who hadn't spoken in 8 years, was watching a plumber with the kind of wonder most children reserved for fireworks or fairy tales. The Seattle rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the time Tom returned to the Harrison mansion the following week. The leak in the west wing had been a stubborn one, requiring a second visit to replace a section of corroded pipe buried deep in the mansion's foundation. His blue pickup truck rattled up the driveway, the engine coughing as it idled. Tom stepped out his boots, sinking slightly into the damp gravel, and slung his toolbox over his shoulder. The air smelled of wet pine and salt from the nearby Puget Sound, a scent that always reminded him of home. He didn't notice Lily at first, tucked behind a cluster of rhododendrons in the garden, her small figure nearly hidden by the broad leaves. But she was there, as she had been the previous day, her hazel eyes tracking his every move. Her notebook lay open on the stone bench beside her, a half-finished sketch of a sailboat bobbing on waves, catching the gray light of the morning. Tom set to work near the mansion's side entrance where the pipes ran beneath a stone patio. He knelt his knees, pressing into the cold ground, and began unpacking his tools, a wrench, a coil of copper tubing, a small propane torch. The rhythm of his work was familiar, almost meditative, and he hummed softly the same tune from the day before a folk song his father used to sing on fishing trips. Lily's presence didn't startle him. He'd sensed her watching the moment he arrived. Kids were curious, he figured, and this one seemed quieter than most. Morning, he called out, glancing toward the garden, without looking directly at her. "Rain's not too bad today, huh? Good day for fixing things." There was no response, but he didn't expect one. He'd heard from the housekeeper in passing that the Harrison girl didn't talk, didn't bother him. He'd grown up with a dog that never barked, but could say more with a look than most people could with words. Inside the mansion, Clara stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She watched Tom work, his movements steady and unhurried, and her eyes drifted to Lily, who had edged closer to the patio, her notebook now tucked under her arm. Clara's heart gave a small lurch. Lily hadn't shown this much interest in anyone, not even the therapists, who'd tried everything from puppets to iPads to coax a word from her. Clara had spent years searching for answers. Her nights filled with medical journals and online forums, her days spent shuttling Lily to appointments that led nowhere. Edward, her husband, was convinced the solution lay in hiring more experts, flying to more clinics, spending more money. But Clara was beginning to wonder if the answer wasn't in a doctor's office, but in something simpler, something right here in their garden. Tom, oblivious to the weight of Clara's thoughts, began to talk, as he worked his voice low and easy, like he was chatting with an old friend. "You ever see the boats out on the Sound?" he said, glancing toward Lily, who was now sitting on the grass a few feet away, her knees drawn up to her chest. "My dad used to take me fishing out there when I was your age. We'd sit in this rickety old boat just waiting for the fish to bite. Sometimes we'd catch nothing but seaweed, but he'd laugh and say it was the best day ever." He chuckled, shaking his head as he tightened a fitting. "Funny how the worst days can feel like the best when you're with the right people." Lily's eyes followed his hands, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to respond. She didn't, but her fingers traced the edge of her notebook, a small gesture that felt like a reply to Tom. Over the next hour, Tom kept up a steady stream of stories, each one grounded in the ordinary. He talked about the time he fixed a burst pipe in a diner during a snowstorm, how the cook gave him a plate of pancakes as thanks. He described the stray cat that followed him home one winter, a scruffy thing he named Patches, who still slept on his couch. He even told her about the time he tried to fix his truck's carburetor and ended up with oil all over his favorite shirt. "Looked like I'd been wrestling a squid," he said, grinning as he wiped his hands on a rag. Lily's lips twitched, and for a moment, her face lit up with a smile that reached her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there, and Clara, still watching from the window, felt her breath catch. She set her mug down and leaned closer to the glass, afraid to blink and miss whatever was happening. Tom finished his work for the day, but lingered a moment longer, packing his tools slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object, a brass valve cap worn smooth from years of use. He held it out to Lily, who had crept closer, her sneakers silent on the wet grass. "This is from an old job," he said, turning the cap in his fingers so it caught the light. "Not much to look at, but it's got stories. Kept a whole building's water flowing once. Want to hold it?" Lily hesitated, then reached out her small hand, closing around the metal. She turned it over her eyes, wide with curiosity, as if it were a treasure from a sunken ship. Tom nodded, like they'd just shared a secret. "Keep it," he said. "Maybe it'll bring you luck." Lily clutched the cap tightly, her smile returning softer this time, but no less real. Clara couldn't stay at the window any longer. She stepped outside, pulling her cardigan tight against the chill, and approached the patio. "Thank you for your work," she said to Tom, her voice polite but strained, as if she were holding back 1,000 questions. Tom tipped his cap, his smile easy. "No trouble, ma'am. Just doing my job." He glanced at Lily, who was still studying the valve cap, and added, "She's a good listener. Got a sharp eye, too." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to say more, to ask him to come back to keep talking to her daughter, but the words felt too big, too desperate. Instead, she said, "We'll call if we need you again." Tom nodded, slung his toolbox over his shoulder, and headed back to his truck, his humming fading into the drizzle. That evening, the mansion felt different, though nothing tangible had changed. The chandeliers still glowed, the marble floors still gleamed, but there was a new energy in the air, faint but undeniable. Lily sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open to a new page. She was sketching again, but this time the image wasn't of birds or waves. It was a rough outline of a man in overalls, a wrench in one hand, a smile on his face. Clara watched, her heart pounding, as Lily's pencil moved with purpose, capturing the curve of Tom's cap, the lines of his calloused hands. Edward came home late. His tie loosened his face, etched with the stress of a long day. He barely glanced at Lily's drawing, his mind already on the next deal. The next tower. Did the plumber fix the leak? He asked, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Clara nodded, her eyes still on Lily. He did, she said softly. And maybe more. The next morning, Lily was back in the garden, her notebook tucked under her arm, the valve cap clutched in her hand. She didn't sit on her usual bench. Instead, she wandered to the patio where Tom had worked, her eyes scanning the ground as if looking for traces of him. Near the edge of the stone, she paused and set something down, a small folded piece of paper. Clara, watching from the terrace, slipped outside to investigate after Lily returned to the house. It was one of Lily's drawings, a simple sketch of a sailboat under a cloudy sky, the word Tom scrawled in wobbly letters at the bottom. Clara's hands trembled as she held it. She didn't know what it meant, not yet, but it was the first time Lily had written a name, the first time she'd reached out to someone beyond her silent world. Tom returned 2 days later, called back to check the pressure in the new pipes. He found the drawing tucked under a rock near the patio, the paper slightly damp from the morning dew. He unfolded it carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the lines of the sailboat. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, tucking the drawing into his pocket. He glanced toward the garden, where Lily sat watching, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Got an artist on my hands," he said, loud enough for her to hear. Lily's smile widened, and though she didn't speak, she scooted closer, her notebook open to a blank page. Tom began to work, his tools clinking softly. But this time he told a new story about a lighthouse he'd visited as a kid, standing alone on a rocky cliff guiding ships through the fog. Lily listened, her pencil hovering over the page as if ready to capture the light he described. Clara watched from the window, her heart a tangle of hope and fear. Edward, meanwhile, was on the phone in his study arranging for a new specialist from New York to fly in next week. "We need someone who can get results," he said, his voice sharp. Clara didn't argue, but her eyes stayed on Lily, who was now sketching the lighthouse Tom had described, her lines bold and sure. The mansion, for all its grandeur, had never felt so small, so focused on a single moment. A girl, a plumber, and a story that was just beginning to unfold. Tom's presence was like a pebble dropped in a still pond, sending ripples through the silence that had defined Lily's world. And though no one could say it out loud, not yet those ripples were starting to feel like the beginning of something extraordinary. The Seattle spring had settled into a rhythm of soft rain and fleeting sunbreaks, painting the Harrison Mansion's garden in shades of green and gold. Lily, now a familiar shadow in the garden, waited each morning for the rumble of Tom's blue pickup truck. His visits had become a regular occurrence, not because the mansion's plumbing was endlessly faulty, but because Clara had quietly requested follow-up checks, citing concerns about the water pressure. In truth, she was clinging to the fragile hope that Tom's presence was stirring something in her daughter. Lily, at 8 years old, remained silent, her voice still locked away, but her eyes were brighter, her movements more animated. She no longer sat alone on her stone bench, sketching in solitude. Instead, she hovered near the patio or the side entrance, her notebook clutched tightly, waiting for Tom to arrive with his toolbox and his stories. Tom, for his part, didn't question the frequent calls. He was a practical man, raised on the docks of Tacoma, where you worked hard and didn't ask too many questions. He liked the Harrison job, good pay, a quiet work site, and a kid who seemed to find his ramblings interesting. That morning, as he pulled up the driveway, the tires of his truck crunching against the gravel, he spotted Lily near a bed of tulips, her chestnut curls catching the morning light. She was holding something new, a small, smooth pebble painted with swirls of blue and white, like a tiny ocean captured in stone. Tom waved his usual grin spreading across his face. "Morning, kiddo," he called, slinging his toolbox to the ground. "That's a fancy rock you got there. You make it." Lily nodded her lips, curving into a shy smile. She held the pebble out her small hand steady, and Tom took it with the same care he'd give a fragile tool. "Well, look at that," he said, turning it over. "Reminds me of the water out by Alki Beach." "Ever been there?" Lily shook her head, but her eyes stayed on him, eager for more. Inside the mansion, Clara watched from the terrace, her hands clasped tightly. She'd stopped drinking her morning tea. It always went cold while she stood there caught in the quiet drama unfolding outside. Lily's small gestures, the painted pebble, the way she edged closer to Tom, felt like miracles, tiny cracks in the wall of silence that had defined their lives. Clara had spent years chasing solutions from speech therapy apps to experimental treatments in San Francisco, but nothing had reached Lily like this unassuming plumber. Edward, however, remained skeptical. He'd returned from a business trip the night before, his briefcase stuffed with contracts for a new high-rise in Belltown. Over dinner, he'd dismissed Clara's observations about Tom. "He's a handyman, Clara," he'd said, cutting into his steak. "Don't romanticize it. We need professionals, not storytellers." Clara hadn't argued, but her eyes had lingered on Lily, who was doodling a sailboat on her napkin, her face softer than it had been in months. Tom, unaware of the tension inside the mansion, knelt by the patio and began inspecting a valve. He'd decided to make a game of his work today, sensing Lily's curiosity. "All right, Lily," he said, patting the ground beside him. "Want to play plumber's apprentice? This here's a shut-off valve, kinda like the boss of the water. You turn it one way, the water stops. Turn it the other, it flows like a river." He handed her a small wrench, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Lily hesitated, then took it, her fingers wrapping around the metal. She mimicked Tom's grip, her movements careful but sure. "That's it," Tom said, nodding. "Now, give it a gentle twist. Not too hard, or it'll get cranky." Lily turned the wrench, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a faint squeak echoed from the valve. Her eyes widened and a giggle escaped her, a soft bubbling sound that made Tom chuckle. "See, you're a natural. Water's gotta listen to you now." Clara, watching from the terrace, froze. That giggle, it was a sound she hadn't heard in years, not since Lily was a toddler. It wasn't a word, not yet, but it was something, a spark of life that had been missing for so long. She stepped closer, her slippers silent on the stone path, afraid to interrupt, but unable to stay away. Lily didn't notice her mother. Her attention was fixed on Tom, who was now explaining how pipes were like the veins of a house. "Water's the blood," he said, tapping a copper tube. "Keeps everything alive. But sometimes it gets clogged, like when you eat too many fries." He winked, and Lily's giggle returned louder this time. She clutched the wrench, her face alight with a joy Clara barely recognized. For a moment, the mansion's oppressive silence seemed to lift, replaced by the clink of tools and the warmth of Tom's voice. Tom kept talking his stories, weaving seamlessly into his work. He told Lily about a time he'd fixed a fountain in a park near Lake Washington, how the kids cheered when the water shot up again. "Felt like a hero for a day," he said, grinning. "Not every job's like that, though. Most days it's just me and the pipes trying not to make a mess." Lily listened, her pencil now moving across her notebook, sketching the fountain as Tom described it. Jets of water arching into the sky, kids running through the spray. She didn't show him the drawing, not yet, but she held the notebook close like a secret she wasn't ready to share. Tom didn't push. He sensed her boundaries the way his old dog Rusty used to sense when he needed space. "You remind me of Rusty," he said, suddenly, wiping his hands on his overalls. "My old dog. Never barked, but he'd look at you like he knew everything you were thinking." Smartest friend I ever had. Lily's eyes flickered with something new, recognition maybe, or understanding. She set the wrench down and reached into her pocket, pulling out the painted pebble. She placed it next to Tom's toolbox, then picked up her notebook, and began drawing again, her strokes faster, now more urgent. Tom watched for a moment, then turned back to his work, giving her space. Clara, still hovering nearby, felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to run to Lily to scoop her up and ask what she was feeling, but she held back. Something told her this moment belonged to Lily and Tom, to the quiet trust building between them. She slipped back into the house, her heart racing, and found herself dialing the plumbing company's number. "Can you send Tom back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's another issue with the pipes." That afternoon, Lily did something she hadn't done before. She wandered to the edge of the garden, where a patch of wildflowers grew near the fence, and picked a single daisy. She carried it to the patio where Tom had left his toolbox while he worked inside. Carefully, she tucked the daisy into the handle of the toolbox, then placed a new drawing beside it, a sketch of a dog, its ears floppy, its eyes kind. The word Rusty was written in small, careful letters at the bottom. When Tom emerged from the mansion, his flannel shirt dusted with sawdust, he found the gifts and paused. He picked up the daisy, twirling it between his fingers, then unfolded the drawing. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well, ain't that something?" he murmured. He glanced toward the garden where Lily was back at her bench, pretending to focus on her notebook. He didn't call out to her, but he tucked the drawing into his pocket and hung the daisy on the rearview mirror of his truck, where it swayed gently as he drove away. Clara found the courage to tell Edward about Lily's progress that evening, though she knew he'd brush it off. They sat in the dining room, the long mahogany table stretching between them like a battlefield. "She's responding to him, Edward," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "She's laughing, drawing things for him. It's more than any therapist has done." Edward sighed, rubbing his temples. "Clara, he's not trained for this. I've got a specialist coming from New York next week. Top of her field. She's worked with selective mutism cases before." Clara's jaw tightened. "Lily isn't a case, Edward. She's our daughter." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Edward looked away, his eyes on the city lights twinkling beyond the windows. "I'm doing what's best for her," he said finally. "We need experts, not plumbers." Clara didn't respond. She glanced at Lily, who was sitting in the corner sketching quietly. The room felt colder than usual, the silence creeping back in. The next day, Tom returned, this time to check a faucet in the guest bathroom. Lily was waiting, her notebook filled with new drawings, lighthouses, fountains, a dog running through a field. She didn't show them to Tom, but she sat closer than before, her knees tucked under her as she watched him work. Tom, sensing her mood, told a new story about a time he'd helped fix a community center's plumbing for free. How the kids there made him a thank you card with glitter that got everywhere. "Still finding sparkles in my truck," he said, laughing. Lily's giggle returned, and this time she mimicked his laugh, her shoulders shaking with silent mirth. Clara, watching from the hallway, felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't a word, but it was a sound, a step, a sign that Lily was reaching out in her own way. As Tom packed up his tools, he noticed Lily's latest drawing left near his toolbox, a river winding through a forest, with a tiny figure standing on the bank, holding a wrench. He picked it up, his eyes softening. "You're gonna make me famous, kid," he said, tucking it into his pocket with the others. Lily smiled, her eyes bright with something that looked like trust. Clara, standing just out of sight, made a silent promise to herself she'd keep Tom coming back, no matter what Edward said. The mansion with its gleaming floors and empty rooms was starting to feel like a home again, and it was because of a plumber who told stories and a girl who listened with her whole heart. The Seattle sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised a long, soaking rain, as Tom's pickup truck rolled up the Harrison Mansion's driveway for what would be his final visit. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and cedar, and the Puget Sound in the distance churned under the weight of an approaching storm. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was no less turbulent. Edward Harrison had returned from a late-night meeting, his face drawn with the stress of a faltering deal, and his patience for Clara's optimism about Tom was wearing thin. He'd finalized arrangements for a renowned specialist from New York to arrive the next day, a woman whose credentials sparkled on paper and whose fees matched the cost of a luxury car. Clara, however, stood by the terrace window, her eyes fixed on the garden, where Lily sat clutching her notebook and a small painted pebble. The 8-year-old's silence had defined their lives for so long, but now, with Tom's visits, there were glimmers of something new. Laughter drawings, a connection that felt like a lifeline. Tom stepped out of his truck, his flannel shirt damp from the drizzle, and scanned the garden. Lily was there as always, her chestnut curls tucked under a knit cap, her sneakers muddy from wandering the wet grass. She waved a small, hesitant gesture, and Tom grinned, waving back. "Hey, kiddo," he called, his voice cutting through the patter of rain. "Ready to help me wrestle some pipes today?" Lily's lips curved into a smile, and she scurried over her notebook tucked under her arm. Tom had been called to fix a dripping faucet in the outdoor kitchen, a minor job that Clara had insisted on, though Edward had grumbled about the cost of yet another visit. Tom didn't mind. He liked the quiet of the Harrison estate, the way the garden felt like a world apart from the city's bustle, and he liked Lily's company, her wide eyes drinking in his every word. As Tom knelt by the outdoor sink, his toolbox clinking open, he launched into a new story. "Ever hear about the time I fixed a pipe in the middle of a storm?" he said, his hands busy with a wrench. "Out near Bainbridge Island, wind howling, rain coming down sideways. The pipe burst in this old community center, and I'm out there soaked to the bone, trying not to let the whole place flood." He chuckled, shaking his head. "But you know what? Standing in that rain, fixing something that mattered to people, it felt free, like the storm was part of me." Lily tilted her head, her eyes fixed on him, the painted pebble rolling between her fingers. She didn't speak, but her expression was alive, as if she could see the storm he described, feel the rain on her own skin. Tom glanced at her, his grin softening. "You ever feel that way, Lily? Like something simple makes you feel big inside?" Lily didn't answer, but she stepped closer, her sneakers squelching in the wet grass. She pointed at a small puddle forming near the sink, where water dripped from the faucet. Tom nodded, understanding her silent question. "That's the troublemaker right there," he said, tapping the pipe. "Want to see how we tame it?" He handed her the wrench, guiding her small hand to the valve. "Slow and steady like we practiced. Tell that water who's boss." Lily gripped the wrench, her movements careful but confident, and turned it. The drip slowed, then stopped, and her eyes widened with a spark of pride. She let out a soft giggle, the sound mingling with the rain, and Tom laughed, clapping his hands. "That's my apprentice. We ought to get you a toolbox of your own." Clara, watching from the terrace, felt her heart leap. Lily's giggles had become more frequent, each one a small victory, but they still felt like miracles. She pulled her cardigan tighter against the chill, her eyes never leaving her daughter. Inside, Edward was on a call in his study, his voice sharp as he argued with an investor. He'd barely noticed Lily's changes, dismissing them as coincidence, but Clara saw them for what they were, steps toward something bigger. She'd spent years chasing answers, poring over medical reports, and sitting through sessions with therapists who spoke in jargon and left empty-handed. But Tom, with his stories and his patience, was reaching Lily in a way no one else had. Clara didn't know why, but she knew it mattered. Tom, oblivious to the weight of his impact, kept talking as he packed his tools. "You know, Lily, that storm I told you about? It wasn't just about fixing a pipe. It was about showing up, doing something for someone else. Makes you feel like you're part of something bigger." He glanced at the puddle, now still, and then at Lily. "Kinda like this puddle here. Small thing, but it's part of the whole world's water, right?" Lily nodded, her eyes bright, and then, without warning, she pointed at the puddle and whispered a single word: "Rain." The word was soft, barely audible over the drizzle, but it stopped Tom in his tracks. He turned, his wrench slipping from his hand, and stared at her. "Did you just—" He started, but Lily's eyes were wide, her hand frozen in midair, as if she was as surprised as he was. Clara, hearing the word from the terrace, dropped her mug. It shattered on the stone, but she didn't care. She ran toward Lily, her slippers splashing through the grass, her heart pounding. "Lily," she gasped, kneeling beside her daughter. "Did you say something?" Lily looked at her, her lips trembling, and pointed at the puddle again. "Rain." She whispered louder this time, her voice small but clear, like a bell ringing in the quiet. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Lily into her arms, laughing and crying at once. Tom stood back, his hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were soft, as if he understood the magnitude of the moment. Inside, Edward heard the commotion and stepped onto the terrace, his phone still in hand. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears. She spoke Edward. She said, "Rain." Edward froze, his phone slipping to his side. He stared at Lily, who was still clutching the wrench, her eyes darting between her parents and Tom. For the first time in years, Edward's expression softened, the hard lines of his face giving way to something like wonder. He stepped forward, kneeling beside Clara. "Lily," he said, his voice breaking. "Can you say it again?" Lily hesitated, then pointed at the puddle once more. "Rain," she said, her voice steadier now, a tiny spark of confidence in her eyes. Edward let out a shaky laugh, his hand reaching for Lily's. "That's my girl," he whispered. The moment felt like a crack in the universe, a shift that made the mansion's heavy silence seem fragile, breakable. Clara held Lily tightly, her tears mixing with the rain, while Edward, for once, had no words. Tom, sensing his place in the scene was done, began packing his tools, but Clara stopped him. "Wait," she said, standing. "You did this. You reached her." Tom shrugged, his cap tilted low. "Just told some stories, ma'am. She's the one who decided to talk." Clara shook her head, her voice firm. "No. You listened to her. That's what mattered." Tom nodded, his smile quiet but genuine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key, an old plumbing tool he'd carried for years. He handed it to Lily. "This is for you," he said. "It's got a word carved on it. Can you read it?" Lily turned the key over her fingers, tracing the etched letters. "Listen." She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and nodded. That evening, the Harrisons threw a small impromptu celebration in the dining room. The staff set out plates of cake and juice, and Clara played a soft jazz record, something she hadn't done in years. Lily sat at the table, her notebook open to a new drawing, a puddle reflecting a stormy sky with a tiny figure holding a wrench. She didn't say much, but she giggled when Clara tickled her, and she pointed at the cake, whispering, "Sweet." Each word felt like a gift, a small miracle that filled the room with warmth. Edward, usually distracted by his phone, stayed present, his eyes on Lily, his hand resting on Clara's. He didn't mention the New York specialist, and Clara didn't bring it up. For the first time in years, the mansion felt like a home, not a battlefield. Tom didn't stay for the celebration. He had a job lined up in Tacoma, a new contract that would take him away from Seattle. Before he left, he hung Lily's latest drawing, the puddle and the storm, in his truck, next to the daisy and the sailboat sketch. As he drove away, the rain picking up, he glanced at the drawings and smiled. He didn't know if he'd see Lily again, but he knew she'd be okay. She'd found her voice, and that was enough. Back at the mansion, Clara and Edward sat with Lily, watching her sketch. Clara noticed the brass key on the table, the word "listen" glinting in the light. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the letters, and made a silent vow to listen to Lily, to Edward, to the small moments that mattered. The lesson wasn't lost on them. Edward, who'd spent his life building towers and chasing wealth, realized that no skyscraper could hold a candle to the sound of his daughter's voice. Clara, who'd carried the weight of Lily's silence like a personal failure, understood that sometimes the simplest connections, a story, a wrench, a moment of listening, could unlock what money never could. Lily, still drawing her pencil, moving with purpose, reminded them that happiness wasn't in the grandeur of their mansion or the size of their bank account. It was in being seen, being heard, being understood. And as the rain fell outside, washing the world clean, the Harrisons began to rebuild, not with steel and glass, but with the quiet, powerful act of listening to each other.